Thanks for joining the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center for Agricultural Profitability for today's webinar. We hold webinars most Thursdays at this time, and you can find a schedule of our upcoming webinars and past recordings at our center's website, cap.unl.edu/webinars. I'm Jessica Grosskopf, an Extension Agricultural Economist with the Center for Ag Profitability, and I'm glad to be hosting a panel of speakers to discuss the recent announcement that Tyson Foods is closing its 5,000 head per day beef plant in Lexington, Nebraska, and what that could mean for the markets and producers in Nebraska and beyond. Questions are welcome throughout today's presentation, and we ask that you do type them into the Q&A panel. So again, please type your questions into the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're glad to be joined by several panelists today from across the industry. I'm excited to welcome Laura Field, who is the Executive Vice President of Nebraska Cattlemen, a role she has held since March of 2023. Laura is a sixth-generation member of a purebred seed-stock cattle operation on the Texas Gulf Coast and has worked in agriculture policy and government affairs for 20 years, including the last 10 in Nebraska. Laura, thanks for joining us. Dr. Jake Smith is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska. His research examines how policies, technology, and market structures affect economic and environmental outcomes. He earned his PhD in economics from Iowa State, where he also served as a postdoctoral research associate with ISU's Center for Agricultural and Rural Development. Jake, thanks for being here. And to lead the discussion today, we have Dr. Elliott Dennis, Associate Professor in Agricultural Economics and a meat and livestock economist here at Nebraska. Dr. Dennis earned his PhD from Kansas State University and has been with UNL since 2019. His research and extension work includes focusing on markets, price analysis, and risk management, including how these and other factors influence producer decision making. Elliott, thanks for being on, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Just go ahead and share my slides. I I do apologize in advance. I have a little bit of a cold, which is kind of a bad timing for a webinar, but I appreciate you kind of working with me today. So glad to be on the webinar. Appreciate Jake and also Laura being on with us today, and they'll have opportunities to speak later. But really kind of wanted just to set the, as Jessica talked about, a lot of questions out there. What is happening? What's kind of been the response? And today we're primarily going to be focusing on, the price impacts, but really due to this plant closure in Lexington, some people have never seen the plant or toured it. It's quite a sight to see. A lot of good cattle that go through there, and a lot of producers. A lot of speculation has been around why they chose that plant. I think we're going to talk a little bit today about, just essentially what it costs to put an animal through the plant, and some potential of maybe that plant was, their unit cost was a little bit higher than other plants. But really this announcement was in line with also with their reduction in Amarillo, Texas. That was primarily thought to be due to the closure and the Mexican cattle not being able to come in from Texas due to the New World screwworm. But after this, Tyson really has five locations now that they're really going to be focusing on. For us in Nebraska, the Dakota City plant is obviously the big one for producers kind of west, going down to the Finney County or the Holcomb, Kansas plant. But as I mentioned, today we're going to focus mainly on the price impacts, what that looks like, talk a little bit about plant structure, what that's looked like over time. But with that, it's not to dismiss the fact that these choices by Tyson and other people, they have real impacts both on the city of Lexington, but the larger community of Dawson County. So although we'll be focusing on that, it doesn't kind of diminish those those impacts for the larger community. This has been a large kind of talking point over the last several years. This is basically beef profitability by sector. This is a large, highlight on a lot of NCBA, and it's produced by CattleFax. Kind of the two kind of highlights here have been kind of the yellow, which you see really kind of beginning in, if we came out of the last cattle cycle in 2015, 2016, when that packer profitability started to increase quite a bit. That was obviously amplified during COVID, which led to a lot of concerns about, different trading practices. And then as the cattle cycle kind of shifted, short cattle, those, profits have kind of shifted more towards the cow-calf producer as we started to build. So kind of setting this up of, why this is happening, it's really a function of, cattle supply has been kind of the dominating factor. This is total cattle inventory from 1965, just to kind of show you where we were at. A lot of people talk about the peak years in the 70s, where we're at in total cattle, over 130 million head. Now we're down below, close to, 86 million head, 85 million. And really, we've become more efficient at beef production. This is cow inventory, annual cow inventory. Obviously, there's a spatial component to this, but essentially we've decreased, our cow herd over time. What this, that's, really two part. One is, do we need as many cows out there to be harvesting? And the second is, what are we doing with the available cows that we have? As you see here, we kind of have this dip. A lot of that has to do with, processing of beef cows. As when we think about processing in general, we have, kind of our high value rib loin product, and then we have a lot of the trim, which is ground beef. And really kind of the saying in the industry, packing industry, is if you can't move ground beef, you don't have a slaughter cattle business. And so when we process slaughter cattle, we essentially get 50s, which is 50% lean, 50% meat, or 50% lean, 50% fat. That is then used to then grind with other products, normally 90s, so 90% lean, 90 or 10% fat, to create our blends of ground beef. Now, there are some different structures of, mixing in and grinding in uh, chucks and rounds to make ground beef, but ultimately we have a large demand for ground beef, and that ultimately spurs on, our desire and ability to process beef cows, both in the beef industry but also in the dairy industry. Fewer cows ultimately mean fewer animals to essentially be raised and future harvested. This falls very closely, obviously, with the total cow inventory really peaking, in the mid 70s at a little over 55 million calves that we were able to actually produce. As we reduce the number of cows, ultimately that means that we have fewer animals to process in the future. Those animals are then pushed through, from different operations all the way to cattle or to feedlots. This is, as of January 1, we're going to receive a new cattle inventory report by USDA AM or NAS in a couple months. But this is what we were at prior to beginning this year. So Nebraska, with the change in the closer from the Mexican border, has really become the predominant cattle feeding state. So some of these numbers in Texas are a little bit lower now. But really, we have the major cattle feeding regions. So we have the Dakota City in the northeast is really killing a lot of the Minnesota, uh, cattle out of Iowa, out of South Dakota, and in the really middle to eastern part the of Nebraska. So what does this ultimately mean? We just talked about, the supply situation. There's fewer cows out there. We're killing more cows because we kind of have this long or, you know, uh, large amount of ground beef out there, or demand for ground beef. And ultimately, we've been able to kind of compensate that through really an increase in dressed animal weights. This is average dressed weights. When we look at just isolating steer or heifer, these are much larger. Steers pushing well above the 950 range. And packers have really been incentivizing this just because we have, through lower discounts and really fixed discounts over the last 3 or 4 years for heavy cattle. But we've been able to put more pounds on but ultimately we haven't been able to fully keep up with total commercial beef production. That's what this is, as this is really showing. This is quarterly uh, slaughter, dressed weights, and also commercial beef production. So going into this year, ending this year, we're still going to be down about 4%. And then in order to rebuild the cattle cycle or rebuild the cow herd back up, we're looking for really decrease year over year decreases over the next couple of years in total beef production. What this ultimately means for packer is decreased utilization at a plant. Packers make uh, money through primarily two reasons, one or through two ways. One is a kill fee, which is on a per head basis, and the other one is through total pounds of beef sold through the plant. So utilization tends to speak more of to how much of the nameplate capacity out there is actually being utilized. This is a number that's been put out there. It's been talked a lot. I do want to say there is a difference between using, let's say, like a rolling average of utilization, looking at total plant kill over time, a 3, 5 year average, versus looking at, let's say, nameplate capacity, which is when the plant is built, this is what it is targeted to kill, either on a 1 kill shift and a 2 kill shift. For example, when the new sustainable beef plant was put in, it was rated at total number of cattle killed per day, and it was stated at a 1 shift plant. So currently, the market with current processing capacity was essentially at 83%, and it was really trending that for the last 6 or 7 months. Highest we've ever been over this year has been 85% packer utilization, and that's strictly a function of reduction. Now, what you'll see is the dotted line. This is 2024 packer utilization. So really two things are happening here that I want to kind of point out. One is the domestic supply on feeder cattle that we have in the United States to reduced herds. The second, the reason why we're running at lower capacity this year is obviously the closure of the Mexican border due to New World screwworm. So two effects going on that has really kind of lowered overall capacity utilization for plants this year. So what does this look like over time, though? I think it's good to look at a little bit perspective of kind of the number of plants out there, and we'll talk a little bit about concentration. So on the top left, this is total federal inspected plants from 1991. So that's right when we had massive amounts of consolidation in the industry through today. We've had a decrease in the total number of federally inspected plants, but this decrease has primarily been in smaller plants and had a lot to do with the structure and the implementation of HACCP and making sure that was compliant across the whole industry. But what you'll see is that even though we've had decreases in total plants, on the right-hand side, federal inspection production has really pretty much remained constant, both on the total head, but we're processing more pounds going through those plants. So where are these kind of plants located? This kind of gives you an idea of kind of where beef processing or slaughter plants are at, kind of where chicken is located and why we tend to focus on chicken processing in the southeast, and kind of where the pork industry is at, and as far as beef processing. A lot of this had to do with kind of the historical evolution of time of where these plants were located. We think about in the 90s or the early 1900s with the development of the railroad and how that kind of shifted, and we were killing carcasses and we're shipping them to major metropolitan areas to be broken down into products. That really changed when we had the overland um, developed of the highway system and had a refrigeration in trucks where we were able to ship those carcasses. So it kind of moved those packing plants kind of further west, and then ultimately kind of resettling into uh, packing plants building in areas where cattle were being harvested. And the big change in the industry happened in the 80s when we had IBP essentially developed boxed beef as we know it today. Essentially, rather than shipping an entire carcass and having a lot of bone and trim and not a lot of value there, why not just do that boning and trimming uh, at the plant? And so that's why we have boxed beef. And that has then shifted over the last 20 years to doing case ready product, and really kind of shifting further downward of that the ability to where labor is and who's skilled and qualified as retail meat processing labor has decreased. Where these have kind of the concentration of these plants over time, this is the total share of total production over time. As you can see, our three large states, Nebraska, us, and our two states below us, Kansas and Texas, have really been kind of the concentration of where processing has happened. Importantly, really the kind of changes when we think about capacity and where that has kind of been shifted. In the early 1990s, a lot of that as a percent of total production you know, was really kind of substituted out of Texas into places like Nebraska and Kansas. So one of the common ways that we measure kind of concentration in the industry and overall, really concentration is we look at what's called a CR4, which is essentially concentration for the largest 4 plants and the largest 8 plants and the largest 20 plants. That's the blue line is the CR4, the largest 4 plants. The red line is the largest 8 plants, and the dotted green line is really the largest 20 plants. This is for cattle, and you can see here that really from 1991 to 21, we had an increase from about 0.7 in the CR4 to about 0.8 over the first 10 years from early 1990s to early 2000s, and that CR or that who are the big 4 has changed as far as name wise, but total processing capacity that they've been able to process has really kind of remain constant. So this kind of shows you, look at total number of plants. We were talking about CR8 and kind of what that concentration looks like over time. It has shifted outward from 1991, from 2021. But really, when we think about total number of plants processing, we kill most of our cattle over think of the 30 or 40 plants that are out there that are federally inspected. These plants come and enter, so plant closure and exit or entry and exit is not a new thing. On the left-hand side of this is plant entrance. These are either new plants or retrofits of plants that are out there from 1991 to 2021. And on the right-hand side, these are cattle exits. These are the number of plants that were exiting as a share of total head that were out there. You can see some of these plants that were exiting were these medium-sized plants that were killing, a relatively smaller share of total production. And then you can see different closures as well as, for instance, the Emporia, Kansas plant in 2008, and then larger plants like the Plainview, Texas, and cattle. So with the reduction in total plant capacity that Tyson's kind of introduced on the table on the right-hand side, you kind of see where that puts it at as far as, the big 4 really taking its step below Cargill into about 18,000. Now this is a temporary, obviously, because they've reduced to one shift kill on the Amarillo plant. So if they expand that up, that would bump them up again, up above Cargill once again. This is just kind of a visual representation and kind of what wanted to show you about why these plants are closure and the justifications that they at least given. I went back and looked at all the different announcements that were in the news media and when they were announced and why they were announced. And this is essentially started from the early 2000s with the ConAgra plant that burned down in Garden City. It was never rebuilt. Then we have, of course, close to us, we had the West Point plant that was harvesting, and then the Box 3 plant that was ultimately replaced by rediverting and the opening of the Dakota City plant. And a lot of that was redirected there. As I pointed out, we had the Emporia, Kansas plant that was long-standing history, multi-plant species plant that was ultimately converted to just beef processing, ultimately closed down in 2008. They decided to retrofit that plant and ultimately converted into ground beef. But as it was kind of announced later that the plant would be closed in 2024. We had a smaller plant in the National Beef Plant in Brawley, which was primarily a Holstein steer kill plant that was reduced. And the most recent one that we often refer to is the Cargill plant that was closed in Texas that reduced kind of steer and heifer capacity. It was vacant for several years and then converted into a kind of a ground beef plant. And of course, we have our most recent one, the Tyson Lexington plant. So we do have kind of the difference between kind of the plant closures that are permanent and temporary plant closures. So I'll kind of I want to highlight some of that. We had the Holcomb, Kansas plant, or the Finney County uh, plant that had a huge fire. There was a lot of speculation that it would go kind of the way of ConAgra, of like it would just be closed forever. That led to a lot of disruption in the market for about a month. And then after Tyson came out and said they were going to rebuild the plant and retrofit it again, markets kind of settled down. But it did have a big shock. And then, of course, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. We can't forget that large plant closures. And then for us in Nebraska, we also had the JBS plant that had a fire in the rendering and didn't really affect total chain speed, but had kind of minor. So this doesn't take into account, the other like temporary disruptions, like we're closed down for cleaning and normal maintenance, but these are shocks to unexpected, closures there. This isn't unique to the beef industry. I just kind of wanted to highlight this is a, a something else put out in 2019. This is all the pork plant closures that have happened and where they've happened over time. So as the markets have become, total production has kind of gone down, and we're kind of resorting some of these plants, even in the pork industry have been reduced as well. So let's go to the price impacts. This is kind of the comparing. I wanted to compare these price impacts, to what it looks like on the live cattle side. And then ultimately, these have large implications for feeder cattle prices. So there's several lines going on here. The black line represents kind of a baseline. The zero right here represents the day that the event happened. So to the left, this would be, in this case, live cattle futures prices pre-event, and then after zero, this is the number of days that were, what was the implications for after the event actually happened. So you'll see here in the COVID-19, that's the blue line. Markets were kind of trending down in the live cattle futures. It had an impact, and then live cattle futures percentage decreased over time. Ultimately, even after 80 days of trading, we weren't back to where we were. Compare that to the Holcomb, Kansas plant, the Tyson plant that had the fire there. Immediately, we dropped about 7-8%, rebounded a little bit on good news. But still, after a month, there was uncertainty whether the plant was going to be rebuilt. Once that announcement came out, live cattle futures started to rebuild, and 40 days post, post fire, the markets and the live cattle futures had recovered. Real dollars here, not diminishing that, but kind of where we were at as far as decrease. So the the red line is where we're at with Lexington plant closure. You'll see that we are decreasing over time in the previous 20 days. If you recall, we had some social media posts that kind of put the markets into kind of a tailspin there for a little bit. But and important to note is that the Tyson announcement came after the cattle on feed report that was there, decreased about almost 5%. Markets were a little bit down, but have since kind of rebuilt, kind of pre-plant closure. So this kind of gives you an idea of there's a difference in kind of a temporary shock where there's uncertainty, as we had with the Holcomb, Kansas plant, to kind of an announcement and the kind of the lead up time of a couple months to kind of resort cattle distribution, which we'll talk about a little bit later. These impacts don't not only have an impact on the live cattle side, they do have an impact on the feeder cattle side. This is the feeder cattle futures nearby contract. You'll see this huge drop here. And what we don't want to do is, immediately attribute everything to that. Unfortunately, kind of the way the markets had kind of lined up that day, live feeder cattle futures ended trading on the Thursday prior. Then we had the cattle on feed report, and it rolled. The nearby contract rolled to the January contract, and so some of this drop, some of this drop here has to do with we are literally just rolling from the November cattle or November feeder cattle contract finishing up, and the new nearby contract January kind of taking over. Um, Feeder cattle markets once again followed kind of the live cattle, but and then now our cents up almost 5% from pre announcement. So immediate shocks, but it kind of shows you how these these announcements kind of play out through time. Once again, that doesn't diminish the fact that if we're short, if we were unhedged or didn't have any price risk management there, and we were selling cattle in the cash market, it hurt, a lot. But, these are obviously kind of short run implications. Markets are going to kind of sort themselves out. And I think Jake is going to talk a little bit about kind of what these prices could look like long term when we lose a plant. And he's done some great work on this, looking at some spatial bidding competition. So Jake, why don't you tell us a little bit about, what that impact looks like long run and how that affects, this larger conversation with AMAs and markdowns.
Yeah, thanks, Elliott. And yeah, I think that's a really good breakdown of everything that's happened recently. So appreciate that. Um, so I've done some research, basically building sort of a computational spatial model of the U.S. beef packing industry and how they buy fed cattle. And that model can be used to kind of think about some of these longer term impacts in terms of how it's going to affect prices and what we call markdowns in the industry. So kind of the background here is that we wanted to build a model that would model what we call imperfect competition among the packers. So we know it's not kind of the Econ 101 textbook example of perfect competition where firms are price takers. They don't have any influence over the broader market. But the fact that this industry is so concentrated, there's meaningful capacity constraints in the industry, and there's also an element of spatial differentiation that kind of gives rise to some market power in the industry. We know that there isn't this perfect Econ 101 perfect competition. And so we wanted to build this model of the imperfect competition among the packers to kind of better understand how prices are determined. And then again, what we wanted to understand was the markdown in the industry, which we define as the difference between the highest price that a packing plant could possibly pay for a head of cattle, and what they actually would bid and pay for a head of cattle. So we're able to look at that within this model. Um, and so one thing I wanted to mention is that all of this is, it's simulated. We're putting this into a model and we're getting output from the model. And so there's, some assumptions that go into that. And obviously, to some extent, those assumptions won't match the real world. But, we have to make some assumptions. Otherwise, we can't put this into a computer and get anything sensible out. And so I just want to emphasize that fact that this is all kind of simulated and modeled and simplified a little bit. But yeah, so as this slide says here, so we have a markdown that we can measure. That's the difference between the highest that a packing plant would be willing to pay and what they actually pay. So this is sort of a measure of buyer power. So the plants exercising buyer power in this industry. One of the biggest sources of this markdown that we find is what we call this sort of like inherent spatial market power in the industry. And so the way to think about that is just think of a simplified situation where there was only two packing plants in the country, one in Nebraska and one in California. When the plant in Nebraska if they're bidding on fed cattle in the state of Nebraska, they don't necessarily have to bid the highest price that they would possibly pay for that cattle because they know those feedlots' next best option would be to ship the cattle all the way to California. at a high transportation cost. And so that next best option for the feedlots is going to be a pretty low price. And so that the Nebraska plant could, in that case, then offer, maybe like 1 cent above what the California plant would be willing to offer, to make sure that they just get those cattle, but they don't have to offer their highest price for it. And so that's this aspect of spatial markdown and spatial buyer power that we're kind of most interested in this research. Another aspect of it is the fact that plants or that firms own multiple plants. And so there's sort of this multi-plant coordination among firms or within a firm where, just the fact that they own more processing capacity and own a larger share of the market could impact their decisions and their buyer power. And then the final piece is a portion due to alternative marketing arrangements, AMAs, or just contracts in the industry. And so market power can arise here because most of those AMAs use as their base price the spot market price based off of the USDA mandatory reporting. What's interesting about that is that because that's the base price for the contracts to be settled on, it gives the packing plants a little bit of extra incentive to lower their bids, because if they can pay a little bit less for their cattle, that not only affects the price they're getting for those particular cattle, but it would affect the price they're getting for all their contracted cattle as well. So all the cattle that are coming in that have a AMA tied to that that base, or the base price of the AMA tied to that local report or that regional report. And so that offers a little bit of extra incentive for these packing plants to offer lower prices and essentially increases their buyer power. So those are kind of the three different portions of the markdown. So you can see in this table, it's the markdown decomposition. What we find in our main paper, where we just modeled the industry and looked at it, was that markdowns were relatively modest. So there really is fairly healthy competition among the packers in the industry. The size of the markdown was about 2 to 2.5% of the fed cattle price in our model, which was calibrated to the year 2022. About 50% of that markdown was due to that spatial component that I mentioned, which is sort of just inherent to the industry. These plants have to be located somewhere, and that gives this differentiation. About 40% was due to the contract, the AMA factor. So the fact that the plants have a little bit of extra incentive to lower their bids. And only about like 5% of that markdown was due to the fact that these firms own multiple plants across the country. In addition, we also we tried to measure what we call this capacity effect. And so that is the effect where, as firms or as packing plants get closer to their nameplate capacity, they can continue to process more cattle, but only at higher and higher costs. So they're, maybe paying overtime. There's going to be more wear and tear on their equipment. They might have to, reduce some of their scheduled maintenance, which has maybe long-term, more intangible costs. But we just tried to model sort of an increase in costs as firms kind of approach and exceed their nameplate capacity. And so we actually saw that in terms of just price impacts, what actually impacts the price of fed cattle the most, that capacity effect was by far the most important. And so, we saw that throughout the COVID, 2020, 2021 years, when cattle prices were very low. We were looking at a situation where those plants were all operating kind of at or above capacity. And now, as we've seen cattle prices increase again, as Elliott showed, these plants have been operating at 80, 85% of their nameplate capacity. And so that has kind of the largest impacts on the actual price. So that's kind of the results from this paper. Like I said, that was all calibrated to the year 2022. That table, Elliott, if you just want to go back one, this table shows what we would expect. So we can use this model to compare the baseline equilibrium that we compute versus a situation where we take the Lexington, Nebraska plant out of the market and kind of recompute this baseline. And so this table just gives kind of a breakdown of what you would expect for that. So across the US, we're looking at a decrease in price of fed cattle of about 60 cents per hundredweight. That effect is a little bit higher in Nebraska, as you would expect, where it's about 90 cents per hundredweight. Interestingly, the markdown, so you'll see in the third column there, the full markdown actually decreases. So the price is decreasing, but that's not necessarily due to market power as we would kind of think about it. But it's, there's actually a shrinking gap between the highest amount that a packer could pay and what they actually pay. So that gap shrinks a little bit, even though the price itself is decreasing. And then I'll just draw your attention over to the far right column where we see that what's really driving the price decrease is this capacity effect. So that by reducing the total capacity of the industry, plants are getting closer to their capacity constraints, getting to the point where costs are going to start increasing a little bit because they're maybe running up against those constraints. And so that capacity effect is going to raise their costs a little bit. And that's going to be where these price impacts mostly come from. So you can go forward now. So this shows the change in that capacity effect. So as you would expect, the black dot there in Nebraska is on Lexington. The shade of red there is darkest around Lexington, although it's pretty dark really throughout the whole kind of Great Plains region. And so that just shows that this is just going to increase this capacity constraint of kind of all plants. So this, I guess I should emphasize, this is kind of estimating what's going to happen sort of when the market reaches a new equilibrium. So this is when all the supply of cattle kind of shakes out to where the new plant where it's going to go after people that were sending their cattle to Lexington figure out where they need to send their cattle now. So this is this new equilibrium. The capacity effect is highest in the counties surrounding the shutdown plant in Lexington, but it's felt kind of throughout the whole Great Plains cattle producing region. You can go to the next slide. So this is the change in markdowns. So again, there's not actually huge changes here. You can see Lexington, the area around Lexington actually shows the largest decrease in the markdowns. And that's because that's where there's this biggest change in the gap between the highest that a plant could pay and what they actually pay. So when that Lexington plant was open, they had some of this inherent spatial market power that I was talking about over the cattle producers nearest to Lexington. So when that plant exits, we see a decrease in that market power. And so that's kind of why we see that blue around Lexington there. And then we see kind of that pale red. So it's a little bit of a markdown increase throughout much of the country, but a lot of that country doesn't actually produce much cattle. And so the overall impact, if you kind of take the average across the whole country, is a modest decrease in the markdown. And then finally, this is just the change in cattle prices that we would expect. So again, the kind of overall ballpark figure was about 60 cents per cattle weight across the country, about 90 cents per hundredweight in Nebraska. And as expected, the highest decreases kind of are concentrated right around that Lexington plant. One other thing I want to mention, again, because this is all from a simulation, from a model, and this is still with the model calibrated to 2022 data. So we haven't had time to actually update the model to more recent data yet. But I would just take all the numbers I've said here as, kind of ballpark figures. Don't attach too strongly to a particular number. But this is just to give kind of a general ballpark idea of what we might expect kind of in this medium to long run. And again, what we found in the model is that the strongest price impacts are due to the relationship between the cattle supply and capacity. And so once we think longer term, and as the cattle cycle continues to have its ups and downs, I think that's going to end up having the biggest price impacts moving forward. Is how does this plant exit and the capacity reduction influence a future upward swing of the cattle cycle? Will we we'll more quickly get to a point where the capacity constraints start to bind. And that's where we see kind of more of those price impacts. So those are just some of the things, I guess that I would kind of take away from this research here that we've done.
Yeah, thanks, Jake, for sharing that with us. Um, and obviously, it's going to change a lot to do with kind of the producer leverage versus the packer and how that changes over time, and leverage capacity kind of to changing. So happy to take questions. I know a couple of these have come through. But before I think we get to those questions, I'll turn it over to you, Jess, to introduce our person or our producer who can really kind of shed some light on what is Lycorn producer side.
Yeah, thanks, Elliott. It's my pleasure to introduce Craig Uden. Craig is a producer and owner of the Dar Feedlot, a 48,000 head capacity facility in Dawson County. Craig is originally from Bruning and is a graduate of UNL. He was inducted to the Nebraska Cattlemen Hall of Fame in 2021 and is currently the president-elect of the Nebraska Cattlemen's Board of Directors. So, Craig, glad to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Yes, we've been working with this plant since its inception. And even before it was here, we've always had packing capacity right here in Dawson County. So when Tyson came along, we had plants like Cornland, and at the time we had a Cargill plant, and they shut down when this plant took over. So very interesting listening this morning. I think we've always known that there was a potential for a shutdown when the capacity, like what's been mentioned before, the underutilization of processing is a big concern. This plant did a lot of specialty products for export, and also NHTC, Gap, and stuff like that. So we knew it could happen, and then basically we run a combination of selling the cattle either in the beef or running on a grid, and we're going to continue on with grids. It's been a challenge to figure out how we're going to deal with the freight. We think we can make up part of our lost revenue by increasing the premium we may get back on some grids, but it's going to cost us probably about $20 on average to move these cattle to any other majors that we might pursue. We do have the new Platte North Platte that is opening, so this is something that's different from just shutting down a plant and not having that option. So we're 40 miles away from a new plant, and I think as that plant expands, we'll probably be working that direction. But we've been contacted by all the four majors, and basically we've been in contact with about 4 or 5 regionals. So we will target our cattle that fits the needs of what those other plants want to process. So I don't think we're going to have a lot of fallout. I worry about some of my smaller producers that have become very comfortable with marketing right here at this location because they do not have the same relationship with some of these other majors. So it could create a business opportunity or partnering with some of those guys that want to feed at home. Maybe they'll grow them at home and feed them with us, or we'll be able to help market those cattle. So been kind of a challenge out here, and I think we're going to we'll meet those challenges, and I think we're going to probably figure out within the next 6 months. I think it's really nice that we don't have a lot of numbers right now. It'd be interesting to see. I think everything we've been watching this afternoon is going to have a bigger effect once we get 95% capacity of processing. One other concern out there is, as we know, not only was Lexington shut down permanently, but Amarillo is temporarily under a 50% reduction down there. So the question still remains, do we have, are we done with the carcass utilization as far as the processing capacity? That's a question out there. But I think we're moving in the right direction by finding different partners and different types of cattle. It'll be a little more challenging for us and in this region, but numbers are down, and there's quite a bit of competition right now for the fewer numbers. We are moving. Timing of the closing of this plant and when they're actually going to shut down should really fall into the smaller number category. So I don't think it'll have quite as big an impact as some of the other closings we've seen in the past. Where those closings, I'm old enough to be around for all them. Every disaster we've had, and they were a little longer affecting because we had more cattle on feed as an industry.
Thanks, Craig. I really appreciate that.
So our final panelist of the morning is Laura Field. So Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jessica, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Jessica said at the beginning, I have the pleasure of serving as Executive Vice President of Nebraska Cattlemen and working with Craig and our leadership and members. This certainly, I would say, was a surprising and really disappointing announcement for us. As a group that represents all sectors of the industry, we've certainly been watching this very closely, and the announcement about the closure came on the same day we got USDA data showing that our cattle on feed numbers in Nebraska were a little higher even than a year ago. We know we've got the cyclical tightness, as Elliott already talked about, but certainly thought those two things happening at the same time were really a disappointing announcement for us to hear. We continue to believe, and we know that there's not a better place to economically raise beef and cattle than in Nebraska, the beef state. So the news is even more difficult to accept, I think, as we see the industry growing here. One of the things that we have done and will continue to do is that we have been in constant contact with our federal elected delegation in Washington, D.C., even in the administration, and we worked as well with our state officials. That's something that we feel really strongly about. We are going to continue to talk with them about how this will impact both Lexington and Dawson County and the surrounding areas. We know this closure will take about 15% of Nebraska's steer and heifer slaughter offline. So those are numbers that are real. So we know that that's going to be an impact. It's a significant cattle feeding region of the state, as we talked about. And we know there's expansion of feedlot capacity happening at the same time as the closure. So we know there's things that are still to come. These decisions and the conversations, as Elliott showed in his graphs, which I really appreciate seeing, cause ripple effects in the market now and in the future. Some of those we're not going to know for a while. So one thing that we do know is that there is a skilled workforce that's going to be the result of this plant closing. And so the biggest message that we have had from Nebraska Cattlemen, and we will continue to amplify, is we don't want to see that plant sit empty. If it can continue to operate in another capacity, further processing or something, or it can be under new ownership and operate, I think it's important that that facility be utilized. So that is the message that we are going to continue to talk with our elected officials, especially wherever they can have influence on helping us there. And we'll continue to engage with producers. We stand ready as a resource, appreciate cooperating with you all at UNL to help put those resources out there. So thanks for the chance to talk today, and really appreciate this information.
Laura.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're going to go ahead and open up for questions. Again, there are several people who are online, so we are going to be asking you to put questions through the Q&A feature, which if you're on a regular laptop is down at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer as many of those as we can, either by responding through a typed answer or through a verbal answer from our participants. So if you have a question and you have not submitted it yet, we have about 8 or 10 minutes here left with our panelists, and we'll work to answer as many of those as we can. So one right at the top, and again, it's open season, panelists, so hop in when you're ready. The question is, does closing the plant increase costs for transportation significantly for producers? who would like to tackle the transportation cost question for producers? Craig?
Yeah, I'll tackle that. Yes, that's our biggest challenge. That's why what Elliott was sharing, what you guys were sharing before, where we lose that leverage, it's in the added cost of transportation. So, and that's not gotten any cheaper. So, the closest next plant is 45 miles, and that would be virtually about par with what we pay here. But if we go to Grand Island, it'll just right about double the cost, and it'll be about $1 more if we go to Cargill, and we're probably choosing actually to go south, and it's probably going to increase it even more than that, probably closer to $1.30 for increased cost, $1.30 to $1.40 on a live basis. So whatever we ship, we're going to have to recoup either through yield or through added value of the animal to offset some of that cost. So yes, it's going to be a detriment for that portion.
Any other comments from the panelists on that question?
No,
All right, seeing that.
I think
Oh,
it's
go
gonna
ahead.
affect, I was just gonna say it's gonna, depending upon where you're located, is gonna really determine kind of that transportation increase. So just kind of taking that into consideration. I think everyone's doing those calculations now.
Great, thank you. Next question is, do LLP and Smart Chicken have processing plants in Nebraska?
I
Anybody have
wanted
any
to,
now?
they did the Fremont plant. I think I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen here. The federally inspected plants are available to be, everyone has access to this. This is on FSIS's directory. And so you can go over here and you can look by, the livestock, and you can do poultry. Let's see, where is it? No, it's on, that's like I said, poultry slaughter. So you can go here and you can look at the plant, and you'll see over here in, I think this is the plant here. It's not the plant, but yeah, I mean, this is where you can find all the information on the plant directory for poultry processing in Nebraska. Jesus is wigging out here.
Thanks for sharing that, Elliott.
And I'll put this in the chat.
Okay. The next question is the Mexican beef that is now being processed in Mexico due to the Texas border being shut being imported to the US? Does anybody have any background on that question?
Let me read it. It's Mexican beef that's being processed. Yes, so yeah, some of that beef is that's processed in Mexico will be shipped into the US. So I can get the exact numbers from USDA. We don't have full trade numbers, but yeah, some of that is happening. But the southern, as Craig knows, the southern plains relies upon Mexican feeder cattle a lot of times to, in the form of almost 1 million head of a process or a feedlot capacity down there. So it is a big impact for them, having the border closed and not taking a position on, whether that's good or bad. But that's just the situation that we have, and that's tightened things up. And as I showed earlier on the processing capacity, where we're at, in Nebraska, even on the cattle on feed, is just, somewhat of a function of, that the border being closed, but also reduced capacity this year has in some part, 3 to 7, 3 to 5%, is, reduction in capacity is due to that reduction in, unavailable feeder cattle supply. But I think Craig mentioned this, and you kind of brought it up in the beginning, Jessica, that the announcement from Tyson not to fully close the Amarillo plant, I think, is a function that they're committed to the region, but recognize the short-term dynamic. Now, if that goes on for long periods of time, that obviously changes, the finance of that plant. So
All right, we'll move on to the next question. The next question is the herd number was much higher when the Holcomb plant closed, and with the Tyson plant closing, the herd number is much lower. Should we expect to see less of a crash in demand because there aren't enough live cattle to keep those plants rolling at full speed? So I think Elliott, you
yeah,
offered to answer this one. So if you want
sure.
to take the first stab at it.
Yeah, I think that herd numbers are one thing. The immediacy of the shock, I think, is the most important there, though, because we can redistribute cattle, as we've shown, over several months if we have enough lead time, knowing that we're going to lose capacity. So I think that's the primary difference now between with the Holcomb, Kansas, where we woke up one day and we didn't have 5,000 capacity. And then for a month, we were uncertain, are we even going to get that capacity back? And so markets were trying to sort that itself out. That was different than this underlying supply, reduction due to reduced feeder cattle, just availability. So that's why I tried to separate out the immediacy of the shock versus a permanent closure, but we have lead time. And so as Craig had mentioned, plants that were shipping or had agreements to ship to Lexington or use them as their cash bidder, um, are now trying to sort through over the next several months where are they going to ship cattle, and that will ease some of the price impacts. That doesn't change the underlying fundamentals in the market, though, right? Which are we are still short cattle. Now we don't have as much capacity as Jake was saying, so that's going to affect some of the pricing, but it's still going to take us several years to build back the herd. And the question is how, at what level do we build it back to?
So I have to jump in there a little bit. I think um, where they give us a 60-day lead time and whatever, we had plenty of numbers here in October, November, and early December. We're running out of those numbers right now. So I think if there was ever going to be a good time to actually shut something, it's probably right now. The question that arises is how slow does that make us respond by losing capacity? Does that slow us down for the rebuild even a little farther down the road now? And if it continues to keep slowing us down to rebuild, do we have risk at other plants to do the same thing to get the processing in balance? So.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll just add a little bit to what Elliott and Craig have already said. I think, this plant's being closed down at a time where the plants are underutilized. Losing capacity in that situation is much different and is going to have much smaller impacts than a situation like Holcomb, where the plants were already at or exceeding capacity, and then you had this unplanned, kind of shock to capacity that, is going to make them even more over capacity, the plants that are still running. And so that's, yeah, definitely going to have larger impacts in that scenario. And so I think we'll see smaller price impacts overall compared to what happened during Holcomb.
I think there's kind of two questions, if you're okay, Jessica, kind of combining them, just about the role of North Platte. Um, the I don't want to speak for North Platte and kind of what they're going to do there. Um, as Craig mentioned, they're having some of these conversations. Kind of should they have agreements? So I don't want to speak for North Platte, kind of what they're doing, but I know they do have a little bit different of an arrangement on the hook space and having shares in the plant and kind of joint ownership. So a little bit different structure than like we would normally think of like a typical plant. So I don't want to hypothesize on kind of what they're going to do. Greg, if you're willing, you could share a little bit about what that conversation has been with North Platte, if you feel comfortable with it. If not, then Okay, yeah, we can just leave that, I think.
All right. Well, we have reached the end of our time together. I know there were a few questions that we were unable to address at this time. However, you will have an opportunity when the Zoom screen closes out to provide suggestions for future webinars. So I'm going to highly suggest that if you did not get your question answered today and you have more questions about this topic or any other, that you hang on and complete that survey and let us know what else you would like to hear from the Center for Agricultural Profitability. So thanks for joining us today. This recording will be posted in the next 24 hours on the Center for Agricultural Profitability's website. Again, when you close your Zoom window, you will see a brief survey. It'll take about 30 seconds for you to offer your feedback about today's webinar and provide ideas for future webinars. And we would love your input. We honestly do go back through all of those suggestions as a team and see what topics come up most often and how we can address them. So thanks to our panelists again for joining us, and everyone have a great afternoon.